Richard showed you one method of calibrating the DO loggers. I'm going to show you another method using our calibration boot. Now, the advantage of the calibration boot is if you don't have a dissolved oxygen meter with salinity, you can use this as a way of calibrating your DO measurements. Now, what I'm going to show is the intermediate data offload. So the loggers have been deployed. We're going to bring them up, do a calibration reading, offload the data, and then relaunch them. So these are our loggers here, and we've got a dissolved oxygen logger and a connectivity logger. I'm just going to focus on the calibration of the dissolved oxygen logger, because that's really what we're talking about. It's the alternate method of calibrating this. So it's logging because it's been deployed. So now what I need to do is take some readings while it's still logging before I stop it and offload the data. So what I'm going to do is use the same calibration boot that Richard showed earlier for the lab calibration. I'm going to use it for a field calibration. So I'm going to take some fresh water, which I brought with me, put the sponge in it, and then wring it out, just as Richard described before. We don't want any drippy water inside our calibration boot. And then I take the sponge, put it inside the calibration boot, and I put it over the logger. Oops. Put it about ½ inch. So that's creating a 100% saturated environment inside, around the DO sensor. So it's continuing to log, so it's going to log the saturated air. Now you have to allow it enough time for it to reach 100% saturation in here, which is sometime between like 15 and 40 minutes, depending upon basically the temperature difference between the water and the air. So let's say you've got a 5-degree Celsius temperature difference between the water and the air. I'd let it sit in this boot for ½ an hour to give it time to, because you've got to reach full temperature equilibrium between the logger and the air, otherwise you won't get an accurate calibration reading. So that's what we're just going to have to wait for a little bit. While we're doing that, I can talk about the other part, is in order to do this boot calibration, you need to have a barometric pressure reading of your, to get an accurate calibration. So there's different ways you can get that calibration, or that barometric pressure reading. One is if you've got a weather station nearby. Another way is if you've got a water level logger that's deployed in the air recording the barometric pressure, or you can just use a handheld meter like this. So that's what I'm going to show right now. Is this meter is telling me that the current air pressure out here is your typical, well, it's 765 millimeters of mercury as my current barometric pressure reading. So I'm going to write that down kind of tentatively in my lab notebook, because you're going to need that later when you use the calibration within the DO data assistant. So I'm going to write down 765 right here. I'll check that again, you know, in ½ an hour after this has reached equilibrium to make sure that it's still at 765. Typically, it's not changing that fast, and it will still be in that range. So what I'm going to do now is just take a little break, and we'll come back after this has had time to reach temperature equilibrium. Well, it's ½ an hour later. We've reached temperature equilibrium with this. I feel pretty good about that now. So we're, first I want to double check the barometric pressure reading. It's still 765, so we're doing well there. I'm going to put that on there so it doesn't blow away. So I'm going to write down the time that it is now. So it's, well, it's just turned 4 o'clock, so 4 p.m. because I'm going to need that in the calibration assistant as well. That's the time I'm going to use as my, my calibration point. So we're calibrated. We've got a good barometric pressure reading, so we're ready to offload the data. So just remove the end cap as you've seen before. Line up the grooves, press the lever, and it's going to offload data in here. And it's going to automatically relaunch it, you know, as it usually does, and it'll offload the data. So we're just going to wait for it to offload the data. Okay, I've offloaded the data from here now. Now what I need to do is I can remove it from the shuttle. You can put the cap back on if you want. And now is when I actually need to clean my my DO sensor off for the next segment of the deployment. So I take the protective guard off, I expose my sensor. It looks like it's got a little gunk on there, so I'm going to take my toothbrush and get that pretty good. All right, you get the idea. Now it's cleaned. It's actually already been relaunched by the HOBO shuttle. So it's logging. And now for my next deployment, I actually need to get an initial calibration reading for my next deployment. So now I take my calibration boot that I have. The sponge is already wet from before. And I slide it back on the logger. And this time I only have to wait 15 minutes because basically I have to allow the air inside this boot to get 100% saturated. But because the logger's already been out in the air and has kind of reached temperature equilibrium with the air, we don't have to wait quite as long this time for this follow-on deployment. So we'll leave it here and we'll let it do its 15 minutes and we'll come back. We're back. It's reached its 15-minute time, so the air in here should be at 100% saturation. I need to, again, get a barometric pressure reading, so I'm going to read this, and it's actually still at 765. So 765, and my time now is, we'll say, 4:20 p.m. So again, I'll need that in the data assistant. So at this point, we can remove the calibration boot and put that under there so it doesn't blow away. It's already logging because it was launched, and we can go ahead and proceed with our next deployment.